American B-25s transformed into ship-killing beasts, the strafer that terrified the Pacific. April 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 Mitchell bombers lift off from the pitching deck of the USS Hornet, bound for Tokyo. The raid is a propaganda triumph, a morale boost for a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor. But as a military operation, it proves what everyone already knows. Medium bombers are not precision instruments. The B-25 Mitchell entered the war as a respectable twin-engine bomber, designed to drop ordnance from altitude and return home. It was competent, it was reliable, it was utterly conventional. But in the steaming jungles and coral atolls of the Southwest Pacific, conventional warfare was failing. Japanese supply convoys snaked through the island chains, feeding garrisons, delivering reinforcements, and maintaining the empire's defensive perimeter. American bombers flew mission after mission, releasing strings of bombs from 10,000 feet. Most of those bombs fell into empty ocean. By 1943, a small group of engineers, mavericks, and frustrated pilots had transformed the Mitchell into something entirely different. They ripped out the bombardier's station, they packed the nose with machine guns and cannon. They turned a medium bomber into a low-altitude gunship, a ship-killing beast that could shred steel hulls and incinerate wooden decks. The Japanese called them devil planes. American crews called them strafers. And when they arrived over the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, they would shatter Japanese naval doctrine and prove that innovation, not tradition, wins wars. The Southwest Pacific Theater in 1942 was a logistical nightmare wrapped in jungle humidity and coral reefs. General Douglas MacArthur commanded Allied forces from his headquarters in Brisbane, Australia. His air commander, Lieutenant General George Kenney, faced a problem that was both simple and maddeningly difficult. How do you sink ships? The standard doctrine was straightforward. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress attacked from high altitude, dropping strings of bombs in the hope that one or two would strike a moving target. Medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell attacked from medium altitude, around 8,000 to 10,000 feet, using similar tactics. The results were abysmal. Ships move, they maneuver, they zigzag. A bomb released from 2 miles up takes precious seconds to fall, and in those seconds a destroyer captain can turn his rudder 20 degrees and watch the explosions fountain harmlessly off his beam. Strike reports from 1942 tell a depressing story. Bomber crews claimed hits. Reconnaissance photos showed ships still afloat, still steaming, still delivering their cargo. The math was brutal. It took an average of over 1,000 bombs to achieve a single damaging hit on a maneuvering vessel. Major Paul Irvin Gunn understood this better than most. Before the war, Gunn had been a civilian pilot for Philippine Airlines, flying Ford trimeters through the island chains. When Japan invaded, he evacuated his family and stayed behind, joining the Army Air Forces as a maintenance officer. But Gunn was no ordinary wrench-turner. He was a tinkerer, an innovator, a man who looked at a B-25 Mitchell and saw not what it was, but what it could become. Gunn's idea was radical, almost heretical. Stop trying to hit ships from above. Instead, come in low, masthead height, and rake them with machine gun fire. Not to sink them outright, but to kill the anti-aircraft gunners, shred the superstructure, set fires, and create chaos. Then, while the ship burned and the crew scrambled, drop bombs from point-blank range or finish the job with torpedoes. The problem was that the B-25, as designed, couldn't do this. Its forward firepower consisted of a single 30-caliber machine gun in the nose, operated by the bombardier. One light gun. Against a destroyer bristling with 25mm automatic cannons and dozens of crew-served machine guns, it was laughably inadequate. Gunn took his idea to General Kenney in mid-1942. Kenney was a rare breed, a senior officer who listened to captains and majors, who valued results over regulations. He gave Gunn permission to experiment. What happened next would change the nature of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The transformation began in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. Gunn and his team of mechanics looked at a B-25C Mitchell and began to tear it apart. Out came the glazed nose, the plexiglass bombardier station that gave the Mitchell its distinctive profile. Out came the Norden bomb sight, that precision instrument that promised accuracy but delivered disappointment. Out came the bombardier's seat, his instruments, his station. In their place, Gunn installed machine guns. 4.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, fixed to fire forward, bore-sighted to converge at 300 yards. The nose was plated over with aluminum, transforming the Mitchell's front end from a fragile glass bubble into a metal snout bristling with gun barrels. But Gunn didn't stop there. The B-25's belly gun was removed. Its ammunition cans were repurposed. Additional 50 caliber guns were mounted in blisters on each side of the forward fuselage. By the time Gunn's team finished, the modified B-25 carried 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. 8 guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. That's over 6,000 rounds per minute of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition converging on a single point. The firepower was staggering, but there was more. North American Aviation, the Mitchell's manufacturer, had been experimenting with an even more audacious weapon, a 75mm M4 cannon, the same gun mounted on M3 light tanks. The B-25G variant, which began arriving in the Pacific in 1943, featured this massive cannon in the nose, along with 4.50 caliber machine guns. The cannon fired a 15-pound shell capable of punching through a destroyer's hull plating. The pilots who first flew these strafer variants were skeptical. The 75mm cannon produced tremendous recoil, enough to slow the aircraft noticeably with each shot. Accuracy was challenging. The pilot had to aim the entire airplane, using a crude gun sight mounted on the canopy rail. But when a 75mm shell struck a target, the results were devastating. It could penetrate a cargo hold and detonate inside, blow open a fuel tank, or disable an engine room with a single hit. By early 1943, the strafer concept was proven. The 38th Bombardment Group, nicknamed the Sunsetters, received the first production B-25G strafers. The 345th Bombardment Group, the Air Apaches, would follow with the even more refined B-25H model, which replaced the temperamental 75mm cannon with a total of 14.50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in blisters, and 2 in the tail. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. Their anti-aircraft doctrine was designed for high-altitude bombers. Their gunners trained to track targets thousands of feet above, calculating lead angles for slow-moving formations. They had never faced an enemy that would come in at wave-top height at 250 miles per hour with firepower that could cut a ship in half. The strafer's firepower was only half the equation. The other half was tactics. And here, General Kenny's airmen developed techniques that would revolutionize anti-shipping warfare. The first was skip bombing, a method borrowed from the British and refined by the Americans. A bomber would approach a ship at extremely low altitude, 50 to 100 feet above the water. At a distance of roughly 300 yards, the pilot would release a bomb with a delayed fuse. The bomb would skip across the water like a stone, ricochet off the surface, and ideally strike the ship at or below the waterline before sinking and detonating. Skip bombing required nerves of steel. The attacking aircraft had to fly straight and level into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire. Any deviation, any flinch, and the bomb would skip too far or plunge immediately. But when executed correctly, skip bombing was devastatingly effective. A bomb striking below the waterline caused flooding that high-altitude hits could never achieve. The strafer made skip bombing even more lethal. Before the bomber pilot released his ordnance, his forward guns would open fire. Imagine you're a Japanese sailor manning a 25mm gun on the stern of a destroyer. You see a B-25 coming in low, barely above the waves. You train your weapon, begin to fire. Then 8.50 caliber machine guns, each firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, converge on your position. The rounds tear through thin deck plating. They shred sandbags, they puncture steam lines and sever hydraulic cables. Within seconds, you and your gun crew are dead or dying, and the ship's defensive fire has been silenced just as the bomber releases its ordnance. The second tactic was the masthead attack, an even more aggressive variant. Instead of approaching from a beam, the strafer would come in from the bow or stern, flying directly down the long axis of the ship. This minimized the ship's ability to maneuver, a vessel can only turn so fast, and maximized the damage from strafing fire. Picture a 400-foot cargo ship or a destroyer. The strafer comes in from dead ahead, guns blazing. Every round that strikes the ship has the entire length of the vessel to hit something vital: the bridge, the engine room, ammunition magazines, fuel tanks, personnel. The gun barrels walk fire from bow to stern, and nothing survives. Deck cargo explodes. Wooden superstructures ignite. Sailors caught in the open are cut down. Then, just before passing over the target, the bomber releases its payload, often a 500-pound general-purpose bomb or a cluster of fragmentation bombs. At point-blank range, misses are nearly impossible. The bomb detonates on the deck or penetrates into the hull, and by the time the B-25 pulls up and banks away, the ship is already listing, burning, or breaking apart. The Japanese had developed tactics for dealing with torpedo bombers. Their destroyer captains knew how to turn into a torpedo attack, to comb the wakes, and minimize their profile. But there was no defense against a strafer. You couldn't turn into 8 machine guns firing 6,000 rounds per minute. You couldn't outmaneuver a bomb skipping across the water at 250 miles per hour. All you could do was shoot back and hope. In late February 1943, Japanese intelligence detected Allied preparations for an offensive in New Guinea. To reinforce their garrison at Leh, the Imperial Japanese Army assembled a convoy of 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers. The convoy would carry nearly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division, along with supplies, ammunition, and equipment. The Japanese were confident. They had run convoys through these waters dozens of times. Their doctrine was sound: sail at night, hug the coastline, rely on air cover from Rabaul, and overwhelm any attackers with concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The 51st Division had fought in China and Manchuria. These were veteran troops, and the destroyers escorting them were among the most capable in the Imperial Navy. American and Australian intelligence knew the convoy was coming. 5th Air Force, under General Kenny, prepared a reception. This would be the strafer's combat debut. On March 2, 1943, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy in the Bismarck Sea, northwest of New Guinea. The Japanese ships were steaming in a tight formation, destroyers on the perimeter, transports in the center. The weather was poor, low clouds, rain squalls, but that wouldn't matter. The strafers would attack from wave-top height. The first strikes came from high-altitude B-17s, attacking through breaks in the clouds. They scored a few hits, sinking one transport and damaging another, but most bombs missed. The Japanese captains maneuvered confidently, their anti-aircraft gunners filling the sky with flak. They had weathered high-altitude attacks before. Then the strafers arrived. 13 B-25 Mitchells from the 3rd Bombardment Group, led by Major Ed Larner, came in at masthead height. Behind them, Australian Beaufighters swept in to suppress anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese gunners saw them coming, twin-engine bombers flying so low that their propellers threw spray off the wave-tops. They opened fire. The strafers opened fire back. Imagine the scene from the deck of a transport ship. You're a soldier of the 51st Division, packed below decks with hundreds of other men. You hear the drone of aircraft engines, then the rapid hammer of machine guns. Then you hear a sound unlike anything you've experienced. A sustained roar, like fabric tearing, but magnified 1,000 times. That's the sound of 150 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the transports like a metal hailstorm. They punched through thin hull plating. They detonated fuel drums lashed to the decks. They ignited aviation gasoline stored for the aircraft at Leh. Wooden lifeboats splintered. Deck cargo exploded. The ship's superstructures disintegrated under the concentrated fire. And then came the bombs. Skip bombs, released at point-blank range, ricocheted off the water and slammed into the ships at the waterline. The explosions opened gaping holes below the surface, holes that immediately began flooding. The destroyer Shirayuki tried to maneuver, her captain ordering hard rudder to avoid a strafing run. It didn't matter. A B-25 came in from the stern, walking fire the length of the ship. The bridge was shredded. The forward gun mounts were silenced. Then a 500-pound bomb struck amidships, and the destroyer began to list. Over the next 3 days, the slaughter continued. The strafers returned again and again, joined by Australian Beaufighters and American A-20 Havocs. They attacked in waves, coordinated strikes that overwhelmed the convoy's defenses. The Japanese destroyers fought desperately, laying smoke screens, firing everything they had. It wasn't enough. By March 4th, every transport was sunk. 4 destroyers were sunk. The remaining destroyers fled back to Rabaul, leaving thousands of soldiers struggling in the water. American PT boats and Allied aircraft strafed the survivors. It was brutal, merciless, and effective. Of the 7,000 Japanese troops who set sail, fewer than 1,000 reached Leh. The rest drowned, were killed in the attacks, or died of their wounds. The Japanese Navy called it a massacre. They were right. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea shattered Japanese confidence in their convoy doctrine. It proved that low-altitude strafers, armed with overwhelming forward firepower, could annihilate even well-defended naval formations. And it demonstrated that technological innovation, not just courage or numbers, could determine the outcome of battles. The success at Bismarck Sea accelerated the strafer program. North American Aviation refined the design, incorporating feedback from combat pilots. The result was the B-25H model, which began reaching the Pacific in late 1943. The H model abandoned the troublesome 75mm cannon in favor of pure machine gun firepower. The nose-mounted 8.50 caliber Brownings, bore-sighted to converge at 300 yards. 4 more 50 caliber guns were mounted in blisters on the forward fuselage, 2 on each side. 2 more guns fired from the tail turret. The total, 14.50 caliber machine guns on a single aircraft. The firepower was extraordinary, but it came with challenges. Each 50 caliber gun required ammunition, typically 400 rounds per gun. That's over 5,000 rounds of belted ammunition, weighing thousands of pounds. The guns themselves added weight. The armor plating protecting the pilots added more. A fully loaded B-25H strafer was heavy, sluggish, and required long runways. But when those 14 guns opened fire, nothing on the ocean's surface could withstand it. Pilots developed new tactics to exploit the H model's capabilities. One technique was the train attack, where multiple strafers would approach a convoy in line-astern formation, each aircraft attacking a different target. The first strafer would rake the lead ship, silencing its anti-aircraft guns. The second would attack the next ship in line. By the time the convoy realized what was happening, half its vessels were burning. Another tactic was the combined strike, coordinating strafers with torpedo bombers. The strafers would go in first, suppressing defensive fire and setting fires. Then, while the ship's crews fought to control the damage, torpedo-armed B-25s or TBF Avengers would make their runs, launching torpedoes into ships that could no longer maneuver effectively. The Japanese tried to adapt. They increased anti-aircraft armament on their merchant ships, adding more 25mm and 13mm guns. They trained their gun crews to focus fire on low-altitude attackers. They began sailing convoys only at night, hugging coastlines where land-based fighters could provide cover. It wasn't enough. The strafers hunted by day and by dusk, catching convoys as they approached their destinations. By 1944, Japanese supply lines in the Southwest Pacific were in crisis. Ships that made it through submarine-infested waters were torn apart by strafers. Reinforcements never reached their garrisons. Supplies rotted on docks because there were no ships left to carry them. The final variant, the B-25J, represented a compromise. It retained the 8-gun nose but restored the ability to carry a bombardier for conventional bombing missions. This flexibility made it popular with squadrons that flew both anti-shipping and ground support missions. By war's end, over 4,300 B-25s, H's, and J's had been produced. They served not just in the Pacific, but in the Mediterranean, where they shredded German convoys attempting to supply North Africa. The B-25 strafer had proven that a medium bomber with the right modifications could become a ship killer as effective as any torpedo bomber or dive bomber. Flying a strafer was among the most dangerous jobs in the Pacific War. The attacks required pilots to fly into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where a single hit to an engine or a control surface could be catastrophic. There was no altitude to trade for speed, no clouds to hide in, no room for error. Lieutenant Robert Bob Hager flew B-25H strafers with the 345th Bombardment Group, the Air Apaches. He described the approach. You'd come in at 50 feet, full throttle, and you'd see every gun on the ship swing toward you. You couldn't think about it. You'd just press the firing button and watch your tracers walk up the hull. Then you'd pickle your bomb and pull up so hard you'd nearly black out. The physiological stress was immense. Pilots pulled high-G turns to evade fire, their vision narrowing to a tunnel, their bodies pressed into their seats. Gunners in the waist and tail positions fired continuously, breathing fumes from spent cartridge cases, surrounded by the deafening roar of engines and weapons. Losses were significant. Aircraft hit by anti-aircraft fire at low altitude rarely had time to recover. A B-25 that lost an engine at 10,000 feet might limp home on one engine. A B-25 that lost an engine at 50 feet crashed into the ocean within seconds. Parachutes were useless. There was no time to bail out. The 38th Bombardment Group lost 58 aircraft during the war, many to anti-shipping missions. The 345th lost 51. Each loss meant a crew of 6 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, or nose gunner, and 2 waist gunners. Some were killed instantly by anti-aircraft fire. Others drowned when their aircraft cartwheeled into the ocean. A few survived, only to spend the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers on the receiving end, the strafer attacks were nightmarish. The volume of fire was incomprehensible, over 6,000 rounds per minute from a single aircraft, multiplied by a dozen strafers attacking simultaneously. Rounds that missed one ship struck another. The ocean itself seemed to boil with splashes and explosions. Survivors described the helplessness. You couldn't hide. Below decks, you waited in darkness, hearing the hammer of bullets punching through the hull, wondering if the next round would find you. On deck, you saw the tracers converging, the red lines of death arcing toward you at 2,800 feet per second. Then the impact. Metal shredding metal, explosions, screams, and flames. The strafer attacks violated an unspoken code of aerial combat. Traditional bombing, even dive bombing, felt impersonal. A pilot released his bombs from altitude and pulled away, never seeing the faces of his victims. But a strafer pilot flew close enough to see individual men on a ship's deck. He saw them running, saw them firing back, saw them fall. Some pilots struggled with this. Others rationalized it. These ships were carrying troops to kill Allied soldiers, supplies to sustain enemy garrisons. War is not fought at a distance, they told themselves. War is brutal, up close and personal. The B-25 strafer's impact extended far beyond the Pacific War. It represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, the willingness to take an existing platform and radically reimagine its role. The strafer was not an incremental improvement, it was a revolution. Before the strafer, anti-shipping doctrine relied on specialized aircraft. Torpedo bombers like the TBF Avenger or dive bombers like the SBD Dauntless were designed from the ground up for their missions. The idea that a medium bomber, a jack-of-all-trades aircraft, could be converted into a ship killer was heretical, but General Kenny and Major Gunn proved it could work. The strafer's success influenced post-war aircraft design. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft bristling with forward-firing weapons, designed to loiter over a battlefield and provide close air support, became a cornerstone of American air power. The AC-47 Spooky gunship in Vietnam, the AC-130 Spectre gunship in Iraq and Afghanistan, all trace their lineage back to Paul Gunn's modified B-25s in Australia. The tactics developed by 5th Air Force strafer crews became doctrine. Low-altitude attack, skip bombing, suppression of enemy defenses through concentrated firepower, these techniques were refined, taught, and passed down through generations of pilots. The idea that innovation, not just courage, wins wars became embedded in American military culture. But there's a darker legacy, too. The strafer proved that overwhelming firepower, applied at close range, could negate almost any defense. It demonstrated that technological advantage could produce not just victory, but annihilation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a massacre, made possible by a weapon the enemy had no counter for. The Japanese Navy never developed an effective response to the strafer. They tried increasing anti-aircraft guns, but more guns didn't matter when the attackers came in so low and so fast. They tried armoring their ships, but armor added weight and reduced cargo capacity. They tried sailing at night, but the strafers hunted at dusk and dawn. In the end, the only defense was not to sail at all, and for an island empire dependent on maritime supply lines, that was no defense at all. The B-25 Mitchell began the war as a conventional medium bomber. It ended the war as a symbol of American ingenuity and adaptability. The transformation from bombardier-equipped bomber to gun-bristling strafer wasn't the result of careful planning by aircraft designers and factories. It was the result of mechanics in sweltering Australian hangars, pilots willing to try unproven tactics, and commanders who valued results over regulations. The strafer's impact on the Pacific War was profound. It severed Japanese supply lines, isolated garrisons, and made reinforcement operations suicidal. It demonstrated that doctrine is not sacred, that tradition is not immutable, and that innovation can emerge from desperation. Major Paul Gunn, the man who conceived the strafer, survived the war and returned to civilian life. He never sought fame or recognition, but his legacy lives on in every gunship that has taken to the skies since 1943, in every pilot who has learned that sometimes the best weapon is not the one you were given, but the one you create. The B-25 strafer terrified the Pacific not because it was the fastest aircraft, or the most heavily armed, or the most advanced. It terrified the Pacific because it represented something the Japanese military, with its rigid doctrine and reverence for tradition, could not counter: the willingness to break the rules, to imagine new ways of fighting, and to turn a respectable medium bomber into a ship-killing beast. In the end, the strafer's greatest weapon wasn't its 14 machine guns or its 75mm cannon. It was the mindset that created it, a mindset that looked at a problem, rejected the conventional solution, and asked, "What if we did something no one expects?" That question, and the courage to answer it, won the Pacific War.